There are things in us that will not give us peace until we answer them. Jung speaks of this pressure as the dead, the ancestors, voices of the unanswered, pressing for an answer through the living. You may already know what that feels like. A repeating pattern that feels stronger than your will. A loyalty you cannot explain. A neurosis with no clear personal origin. Or a dream that feels older than your personal life. Some questions do not die when a person dies. They remain unfinished. They seek a continuation, and they press upon the living. For Jung, ancestry is not a romantic idea. It's not a metaphor. It is an ethical and psychological fact. In his late interviews, Jung speaks with unusual directness about this pressure. He says, "It seemed to me that the dead harassed me terribly so that I would finally give an answer, that everything depended on that." So here is the question we are facing. What does it mean to give an answer to the dead? And why would Jung claim that the dead need us? An answer, not an opinion, not a belief, a lived response that deeply changes how you stand in life. Jung refuses to define the dead in a narrow way. He asks, what does the dead mean? What does the ancestors mean? Are they the physical ancestors, the spiritual ancestors? One does not know. The dead are not merely personal ancestors in the family tree. They are unfinished inheritances, unresolved tasks carried through blood, culture, religion, and psyche, unlived potentials in a lineage. And when Jung speaks of ancestors, he even frames the living person as a synthesis of ancestral life. Is this karma I am living that which I acquired in my past lives? Or is it from my ancestors out of whom I am formed? Am I a particular combination of the life of my ancestors, and am I incarnating their life again? But as a multiplicity synthesized in me, stepping forward into the present with a historical question? Or was it I who lived back then, and did I get so far in that life that I can now attempt an answer? This I don't know. The Buddha left this question open. I would assume that he himself did not know with any certainty. The living psyche is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a part of an ungraspable, interlinked whole, a place where many lives stream together. Jung claims that the dead do not automatically know more. Death does not complete the work of consciousness. He says, "Back then and from then on, the dead became ever clearer to me as the voices of the unanswered, of the unresolved and the unredeemed. But evidently, they only know exactly as much as they knew at the moment of death, but nothing beyond that. Hence the strong desire of the land of the dead, or of the dead themselves, to keep intruding into life in order to participate in the life of the living." This is the central claim. The dead need the living because the living alone can grow consciousness in time. The dead remain bound to what they were capable of at death. So they intrude, not necessarily as ghosts in a naive sense, but as psychic pressure. Repeating patterns in relationships, inherited shame and fear, irrational loyalties you cannot explain, neurosis with no clear personal origin. They press because they want participation in life's forward movement. They want development. Jung gives a direct example from his own inner history. He describes the emergence of his 7 sermons to the dead and the period where the dead appeared to him inwardly. The soul, the anima, creates the relationship to the unconscious and likewise the relationship to the collective of the dead, for the unconscious is also the land of the dead. Like a medium, she gives the dead the possibility of manifesting themselves. That is why very soon after the disappearance of the soul, the dead appeared to me, and the 7 sermons emerged. The voice of the dead is a psychological mechanism. The anima, as mediator to the unconscious, becomes mediator to the dead, because the dead belong to the same psychic territory. The unconscious as the land of the dead. This matters for the living task. If you cut off relationship to the unconscious, you also cut off relationship to the dead, and the result can be a kind of unconscious possession, where we live out patterns we do not recognize as inherited. Jung's language becomes explicitly moral. In hate and fear, and expectation and faith and hope that a living person, a conscious man, would give an answer to it, that everything depended on that, for they cannot come out of their timelessness, out of their eternity. Evidently, only a person who has come into the world can do this. Only an embodied consciousness can respond. Only someone under the conditions of time, conflict, limitation, responsibility, and choice. And Jung insists that this response cannot be borrowed. He says, "I gave my dead my answer, and that has nothing to do with anyone else, for they would only want to know what sort of answer it was, and would only parrot this because they do not want to give their own dead an answer." This is a hard truth. We want ready-made spirituality. We want a formula. We want to quote somebody else's resolution, but that is avoidance, because what is demanded is not information. It is an answer, a lived decision, a born tension, a sacrifice of a one-sided life, a new attitude that changes behavior, a meaning that is paid for with suffering and honesty. The dead do not need our opinions, they need our consciousness. A neurosis can be the psyche signaling that something essential has not been answered, not only in our personal biography, but in the deeper inheritance we carry. Meaninglessness is often the symptom. The unanswered presses for attention. Jung observes that people become neurotic because they had made do with fragmentary answers to the questions of life. Then it becomes clear that their life has no meaning, and that they are neurotic because it is quite meaningless. In other words, when the answer is avoided, life becomes meaningless and a fertile ground for ills and more suffering than is necessary. Jung also frames the problem as intergenerational ethics. Parents bear a massive responsibility to their children if they themselves remain unconscious. They then leave behind to the children an enormous spiritual tension and burden, which inflicts a great wound upon them. My parents bequeathed me a strain like this, and I have prevented it from exploding only through my utmost concentration on the essential. This sentence offers a definition of the ancestral task. What remains unconscious in one generation becomes a burden in the next, a psychological inheritance. So to work consciously on ourselves is more than self-improvement. It is ethical duty. You do it for your children, but also In Jung's frame, you do it for the dead. Jung's statements imply a practical path, an existential answer. It begins when you take seriously the repeating pattern you cannot solve by willpower. It deepens when you approach dreams not as entertainment, but as messages from the lineage of the soul. It becomes real when you stop blaming only the present and begin asking, what older story is being repeated through me? What unfinished conflict is seeking consciousness in my life? What myth is living through my family, forcing patterns that are unconscious and unhealthy? Jung points to the importance of conscious creation. What a person creates or realizes on earth comes into the beyond as a new thing. With that, space is created for the dead so that they can develop. A transpersonal, collective meaning to our lives, personalities, suffering, and our creations. When a living person realizes something, a new possibility enters the total psychic field. Something becomes available that was not available before. That is Jung's claim. This view and Jung's general perspectives are not easily accepted because they remove our excuses and demand that we take more responsibility for ourselves and for the transformation of the unconscious. If the dead can develop only through what the living make conscious, then focusing on what I want from life transforms into what is life asking of me. And where am I the vessel in which the unfinished must become finished? The answers cannot be copied, they must be lived. We each face those essential questions, either unconsciously or consciously. This task is demanding us to carry the tension consciously, to face the rejected, dark and forgotten sides of our being, our personal and ancestral shadow, and to realize meaning where it has been refused or lost. It is as if the dead are listening and everything depends on us, the living, to come up with an answer.